Welcome guys. This is not going to be a very happy video. I'm here to review and talk about the conclusion to the Icebrood Saga. The most recent patch came out yesterday, and sort of give you guys a little bit of my take on it. And really, this was a release that deeply disappointed me. There will be spoilers, so if you haven't played it yet, you are warned. Though, to be honest, hearing the facts of the release is probably a little bit more entertaining than actually playing through it. So before I actually got in there, I threw up a YouTube poll for you guys. Here, I'll put it on screen, wondering what people's takes were. And immediately I saw a little bit of a red flag here. I should have seen an even bigger one. The major consensus right at release, when there's a lot of hype, obviously, and there was a very exciting article that came out alongside the patch talking about the future of Guild Wars 2, which was positive. But the main response from you guys, as you can see, was mostly average. You might interpret that as, oh, well, okay, the devs hit par for the course, what's the big deal? But you got to remember, this is the conclusion to Champions, which we've been working away on for months. It's the conclusion to the Icebrood Saga, and in fact, it's the conclusion to a decade-long story and the closing of one of the biggest elements of world building and things I, and I'm sure many other players, have been looking forward to in the game. And it was concluded in an average patch. And in fact, I actually think that the community here is being way too forgiving on this release, calling this just an average release. Because of what it stands for, because of what it's done, I actually would give this a 1. I threw out this tweet last night. I said I think that this is probably one of the worst patches that they've done for story since we were fixing signs in Flame and Frost. I do think fixing signs in Flame and Frost is probably worse because the expectations for what Living World could be were very high, and I think the devs really disappointed a lot of people, and it kind of put Guild Wars 2 into a place that it never should have gone, and there wasn't much gameplay there. The other big point of comparison I'd have for this patch is actually the Zaitan fight at the end of the personal story. On balance, I do think that is still slightly worse than this new release, so congratulations, ArenaNet. You beat the Zaitan fight, but the Zaitan fight is something a lot of players don't experience because it's at the end of a very long and slow, mediocre personal story, and the Zaitan fight has absolutely no real gameplay in it whatsoever. You just press 2 on a cannon. At least this new patch, you do get to use your buttons a little bit. Footage in the background will be my first ever playthrough of this release, and well, it will probably loop a few times because guess what? It's only a half-an-hour patch. This is one of the biggest problems with this release. They're concluding some major epic long-term stories in what is probably the shortest Living World release we have had since Season 1. So Season 1 was filled with infamously short story beats that kind of gave the team this reputation that this game you could beat the patch in 1 hour. And the sad thing is, Guild Wars has this reputation, but it's never really been true. Even during Season 2, you're looking at like 2 hours for a story release, more if you're actually engaging with it, even more if you consider stuff off the golden path to be a part of the release. The reality of having an actual release genuinely take, not 1 hour, which is what people joke and criticize about, but half an hour, is tragic. I mean, a lot of these Champions releases have been split up. I'll talk about that in a second. And they've been kind of circling the drain, so to speak. They've been getting pretty short. But to have the final one be the shortest of them all by a wide margin is truly disastrous. And what it means is the death of Primordus and the death of Jormag, 2 of the Elder Dragons, the battle and struggles against which this entire franchise has been predicated on for 10 years. The cliffhanger of the previous game was entirely about, got wrapped up in half an hour. And I really do mean half an hour. Some of you guys might cynically sit there and say, well, you know, the whole Icebrood Saga's been building up to this, right? So you kind of have to credit the previous releases. I don't credit the previous releases because they basically had nothing to do with this sudden situation we're thrust into on this release that manifests out of nowhere and then concludes just as quickly as it appeared. God, I'm getting flashbacks to the shoddy stuff that happened in Heart of Thorns as well. So let's take it back a second. I do want to explain the situation the game's been in because to a certain degree, the Guild Wars 2 team does have my sympathy. This was never going to be a great release and my expectations were already pretty low. If you're out of the loop, it looks like they had something really big planned for right after Kralkatorric's death. It felt like that was the end of Guild Wars to a certain degree. But whatever chaos occurred at the studios, there were mass layoffs, projects got cancelled and shuffled around, and the team was left scrambling. They went for the Icebrood Saga, not an expansion following Season 4. And they had the job of delivering a Living World season that was as captivating as a full expansion boxed release would have been. And that's what they told people, that Icebrood Saga was expansion quality. It really had to hit that impressive bar. You know, the most exciting concept for Guild Wars, I think for most players, is that Living World is bridges between expansions, not just living world forever. So they didn't call it Season 5, they called it the Icebrood Saga, and they said it would be expansion quality. We had a long wait for the start of it, which I think people were generally forgiving of because of the layoffs, but once it kicked up, clearly they hadn't really budgeted or pushed it as an expansion-like replacement. There weren't new legendaries coming in, there weren't elite specs, there weren't interesting new masteries on the scale of gliding or mounts, and the players realized it pretty quick. Even though the first 4 episodes of the Icebrood Saga really aren't that bad, they are about on par with Season 4, I think people were disgruntled. COVID hit last year, and then 2 of the big releases had no voice acting, which I think tuned even more people out of the game, and it seems that somewhere around now, ArenaNet decided to course correct. They decided to go, so to speak, all hands on deck with a new expansion set in Cantha that would really get people excited. They threw that teaser trailer out, and the Icebrood Saga was left being developed by a skeleton crew. That's why they have my sympathy. That's why my expectations were low in the first place. They were basically told they could do 1 more episode of the Icebrood Saga that had the duty of finishing this story and spread over a long enough time span that it would buy, the rest of the team time to keep making End of Dragons and get it to a better position. And even now, we've got a 3-month wait for a live stream to start getting details on the expansion anyway. So here's the crucial fact. They had their plans for the Icebrood Saga story, which clearly was that it was Jormag versus Primordus from the beginning, before the funding was cut and so on, and that by the end, both of them would be dead. And upon hearing that they only had the Champions release to work on, they still tried to squeeze this story in. They chose not to also course correct the story subject material, they just tried to fly through it. The reasons for which are very obvious and very disappointing, and I'll go through in a moment. Let me take you back for a second. At the point of the previous full release, we hadn't even really been introduced to the idea of Primordus this saga whatsoever. We had seen some Stone Summit dwarves. We had seen some scales of Jormag suggesting some previous battle with Primordus. There was the red among the blue on the Icebrood Saga branding logo suggesting something would happen. That was it. They threw out these bang-hour conversations while Champions was in development, which did the entire job of introducing that Primordus would be active. And then the entirety of the Primordus storyline, killing this Elder Dragon, the first one that was introduced to us, that an entire expansion of the previous game revolved around fighting one of his minions, the original Elder Dragon. He was just killed off in Champions. These mini releases, and finally one story instance that takes less, frankly, the actual instance itself takes less than half an hour. Primordus is never fully modeled. We only ever see his head that looks completely different than it did in Guild Wars 1 because the devs don't have a decent internal lore wiki and they read into a mistake that a fan put on the public wiki. His size is inconsistent from the size we had in Draconis Mons as he's shrunk down because the devs realized they can't actually depict any kind of decent content within engine in a tiny instance like this. He has no victories throughout the course of the story, no interesting new societies that were rallying against him, no new models of destroyer or bad guy that we can fight as fodder. We never go to his territory, the depths of Tyria, even for a moment. He just sits there and then he dies. Not only this, but Jormag, who the Icebrood Saga had previously been focusing so much on, doesn't even have any dialogue here. And the previous dialogue and its abilities of communication and persuasion and, sneakiness and is it lying and stuff means absolutely nothing by the end of this story. It's just another static prop to be hand-waved. So this is really at the root of why I despise this patch so much. It's because such a major story beat, 2 Elder Dragons at once, the whole Dragon v Dragon thing, you get like a couple of seconds of a cutscene to enjoy, has been played out now and thrown away in the rushed pursuit of this next expansion. Many of you guys might not be in this position, but imagine being a Primordus fan. Imagine being someone who played Eye of the North and fell in love immediately with the Destroyers and those earthquakes that racked the world just because one of its minions woke up, and being invested all this time to see what happens to your favorite, only to experience this. ArenaNet have built this game story around the destruction of the Elder Dragons. You cannot rush or handwave the actual destruction of the Elder Dragons. And that's what they did with Champions. And again, they have my sympathy, but there were so many ways through this. And that's what I want to look at as we go through this video here. First of all, a quick review, some of the positives and negatives. I have positives. I have 2 positives. There were 2 things I liked about this patch. First of all, once all is said and done, they do actually establish that Bangar Ruinbringer, who's a fantastic character, well-written character, an interesting guy to be on screen, and entirely the product of the Icebrood saga, he survives and will hopefully go on to influence the story in meaningful ways in the future. And the other thing that I liked about the patch was, and I can't deny this, it was at least cinematic. There was good cinematography, there were good colors, the visuals of this battle you've been watching in the background are pretty decent. You know, I think Primordus, his head, though that's all we get, is really well textured and he's kind of entertaining to see. I actually quite like the way that Jormag looked as well, ignoring the size discrepancies and the fact that they are just their heads. There's some nice stuff going on here. This absolutely comes nowhere near the Season 4 Kraukatoric stuff, in which we got to fly alongside it, fighting it on Aurine's back. You know, where's our scene with these 2 dragons flying in the air, fighting against one another, Godzilla v Kong style? It's not like in Season 4 where there was a whole open world map where its body is on display and moving and you can actually climb around on. It's not like in Season 4 where you get to go inside their mindscapes and see like another variant of how these Elder Dragons might be represented in their cores. It's not like Season 4 where we have that epic battle in the auditorium where a ton of characters have dialogue and they're constantly taking control of the camera and we're flying over top with a ley lines and we've got that beautiful music with the special action hotkey on the crystals and so on. But it is a little bit pretty. I mean, look, if that was enough to satisfy you guys on this release, the devs were capable of jingling the keys and distracting you while the rest of the house falls down, then I suppose cool, the patch did what it had to. Speaking of the house falling down, let's run through some early thoughts. First of all, I really despise how quickly the solution to this problem of both Elder Dragons manifests. Aurine just suddenly realizes that the ley lines are kind of pulling her towards them and we can abuse this to get both dragons together. Let's ignore the fact that Jormag is cunning and persuasive and a schemer. That doesn't matter anymore. Jormag can just be moved wherever we want Jormag to be as soon as we want it now. And don't worry, Jormag won't speak to you during this release, won't argue her case. She's just going to stand there so you can kill her. Next, there were too few characters present on this one. What's the point of giving us all of these dragon response missions over the previous 3 releases if you're not even going to properly utilize these characters we've been talking with there in the battle? I can understand that you might not have time for all the voice acting for them and so on, but at least having them be a little bit more relevant. Just the auditorium scene alone from Season 4 was able to give the sense that there were lots of allies you had recruited that were actually doing things. On this one, they're just kind of walking around with you, and many of them are unnamed NPCs. Speaking of characters present, what about Aurine's influence in this patch? She has some dialogue where she's suggesting she's struggling and needs our help. None of this really properly gets across. At one point, I just kind of looked up and realized, oh, Aurine is a part of this fight, I guess. And the cinematography there, I think, was a complete letdown. Let's talk about a big dropped plotline. Why is Bram's bow not a part of this? Like, the saga opened with him getting drunk and losing his bow. There was a whole plot about Bangar getting the bow and shooting us with it. Ryland hid it off screen somewhere. And then the bow has nothing to do with the fight itself, so we lose the whole Askia connection. This is the Icebrood saga, right? There is still meant to be some valuable Norn influence or heritage or meaning here. Well, they never found a good way to shoehorn that in, apparently. They did manage to shoehorn in a fight with Ryland after all was said and done. I don't know about you guys, but if it were me, I probably would have given Ryland the bow during that fight, right? Maybe he's using his Icy Grey Sword at the start and then he weapon swaps below 50% health to using the bow. At least then it would have had a look in and we could have immediately explained Bram getting it back as some kind of prize for the end of the saga. But no such luck. I guess the devs will either drop that completely and it will be missing forever, or they'll have to clunkily reintroduce it somewhere down the line. Speaking of Bram, why is Bram alive at the end of this story? First of all, it doesn't make sense that he would be inside an Elder Dragon as it is destroyed through all those chaotic energies, and he's still alive. The devs acknowledge this, at least in the dialogue with him actually asking that very question. I suppose to a certain degree, the commander survived the death of Kraukatoric while being inside him, but we weren't connected with his consciousness to the degree that Bram had been with Primordus. And I like the touch of him being buried in the snow. It kind of reminds me of Dagnar Stonepate and Rurik to a certain degree. But they give no real explanation. And besides that, even if they could give an authentic reason why he's alive, why is he alive narratively? I know some people still feel like they want to get something out of Bram, but there's really been very little loss in the story lately. It seriously feels like if you're a member of Dragon's Watch, you have plot armor, no questions asked, and it's robbed the universe of its stakes. I actually think the loss of Bram here, in the pursuit of the destruction of 2 elder dragons, would have at least underpinned this moment with some emotion. And he's a Norn. His legend will live on. He'll go to the Mists and be reunited with his mother Air. It's not all tragic. We've already explored this character up and down with an arc where we fall out with him and then we become friends with him again. He does something great. They even had this idea of the in-universe prophecy suggesting maybe he should have gone out here. So now what? He'll just be kind of lamely wandering around. He'll retire off to Holbrack, a bit like how Rox is still lamely wandering around after she retired off to the Omicron. And these characters and why I'm investing in them continues to feel a bit arbitrary and pointless. It really just feels like the writer's room doesn't have balls, and I want to say it's because, they know that this is going to be a bit of a shoddy release, so they won't kill Bram because they can't really do it justice. But then I realise they're happy to kill 2 elder dragons when presumably they full well know that this is shoddy work. What, are we so invested in these characters that they're more important than what the franchise has been built around? The big world epic stories of the elder dragons. You'll throw them away in a small patch like this, but you won't throw Bram away? So no, I think they just didn't have the guts to do it. And even in that case, why isn't he injured or changed in any way? He just pops out looking perfectly normal. I doubt we'll see a single lasting consequence to this character, but that's something ArenaNet's always kind of failed with. What happened to Logan when he got corrupted by the blighting pod again? Oh yeah, nothing, really. While we're skirting the issue, let's talk about the Spirits of the Wild, and I just want to point out how many characters and moments should have had dialogue here, but didn't. And again, this kind of ties into the fact that the release was so short, but the Spirits of the Wild's role in keeping Bram alive, as gimmicky and hand-wavy as that is explained by Bram. They themselves are not present. Jormag doesn't speak. Bangar doesn't get a moment to speak and has a bug where he's supposed to be not in the cage anymore, but he is still in the cage. There's basically no sense of an epilogue at all. So any kind of fallout from this event and a catch-up where maybe you get to speak with the Crystal Bloom or really dig in with Aureen what you think happened doesn't exist. Another one of the big emotional beats they want me to be invested in is the Ryland with his mommy and daddy story, Ritlock and Crecia. Honestly, I do like this story's inclusion in this patch because if it wasn't here, all the Grothmar stuff and the Char Civil War stuff from earlier in the Icebrood saga would have looked like a complete waste of time. And it's nice to get a real proper cutscene at the end of the story to kind of go back and reflect on when you're watching, say, the Bangar's office cutscene from earlier. I even like all the decisions they made on this one. Ryland is basically just a power-hungry dick of a Char. Ritlock killing his own son is a pretty brutal Char-like thing I kind of like to see. It could have been Ryland killing Ritlock or Ritlock killing Ryland. Both of them feel pretty authentic and well-fitting. I'm not too much of a fan of Ritlock then breaking down and crying over the corpse of a son he didn't even know, and he's a Char where there's not these strong connections with your cubs in the first place. But I know a bunch of you in the comments will argue the toss about how Ritlock's so much better now because he's an outlier of his society. And at least Crecia is cold and badass and stern in the face of the death of her own son. There's a good argument between them. Maybe I would have bought into Ritlock's sadness a bit more if they actually had more screen time and opportunity to have these characters interact, but they didn't. So even if this is consistent with his character, it still feels unearned. And Guild Wars as a franchise continues to be a story that never gets me remotely emotional as far as being upset. Maybe one day, ArenaNet. Let's talk about more missing dialogue. There's no interesting dwarven interactions. This is the death of Primordus. The dwarves were thrown in one of the DRMs, but basically do nothing. No opportunity to speak with them in any meaningful way. Just the weird cryptic hints from the destroyers of the Great Bridge or the destroyers of the last Iron Hammer and so on. No interesting dialogue or content from Jarvi, who you remember was such a prominent NPC that she was appearing in the foreground as like a core member of the group during those Icebrood Saga initial cutscenes. Back to Primordus related characters, I was happy to see a little bit from the Arcane Council, but once again, no Zodja. Guys, this is it. it. It's over. Primordus is dead. You know what that means. It reveals all these holes that have been bubbling away under the surface and now really won't get resolved. I don't know if we'll ever see Zodja in Guild Wars 2 again. I think the character is permanently retired and the devs are just too scared to talk to us about it. She should have been there for Crecia. She wasn't. She should have been there for the Asura's arch nemesis, and she wasn't. Basically, anything you might have been excited about from a Primordus arc, like a return to the depths and meeting up with close societies of Asura that still live down there, other subterranean creatures we may have never met, or some that we have met and now may have more of a stake in the story. If you wanted to see a big Skrit hive mind plot where they help against Primordus, anything about the dwarves, they chose not to do it here. You'll never get to see it. What you will see is Bram acting like a zombie with the spirits of the wild, trying to control a dragon, whose defining feature is that he's supposed to be a primordial force of nature that can't be controlled. Instead of leaning into that, they turned away from it. And let's talk about the moment of actual death for these dragons. I wasn't even sure it happened in this patch. And that's not just disbelief that it had come and gone so quickly, but the actual structure of the cutscene, and then loading into the Eye of the North, and then loading back to the map, and you can't even really see any defined corpses of these dragons because they didn't model the entire damn things. It was just their heads, and that probably would have looked weird. Genuinely left me scratching my head as to, like, are the dragons still here? Are they gone? Have they run away? The dialogue's unclear about it until, like, quite a bit later when they just say, oh, yeah, they're dead. That is it. They're dead. And there's a little bit of a hint after that about the deep sea dragon. It really feels like they vanish off screen just as quickly as they apparated before us in this perfectly constructed arena. And what happened to the magic? Well, don't worry, it's okay because Aurene got it. How do we know that? Well, because she told us. Once again, and this has been a consistent problem the whole way through Champions, even earlier than that, the devs have not been explicit, they have not been clear enough to say Aurene will take all of the magic now. We're not finding multiple dragon replacements, we're just using her, and it's okay for us to destroy them. The world isn't going to end because she will control them. This is like major subject material that Season 4 was really balanced around, and at no point were they clear enough about this stuff, not even right here up until the final fight. What Aurene's specifically doing in this battle, what we're specifically doing in this battle, is so hastily constructed, I almost can't even get a latch on it. Don't worry, just go over to these prisms and that will in some way be beneficial. Yeah, look, see, look, they're dying. Okay, thanks. There are obviously problems with the tuning and the balance. The footage in the background, you see, I dared to play this with 4 other people, which of course meant that there was no real gameplay to experience. But that's not a problem with just this release. That's a problem with Guild Wars 2 in general, and a story for another day. So, that's my take on the patch. And after playing it, I did return to what I discussed to you guys earlier in my mind and thought, well, you know, it's been difficult for them. They obviously are working on End of Dragons. They revealed that to us on a stream, that this is basically a skeleton crew. How much were you going to expect? And I would like to forgive them at this point. But I think there were so many better ways to go through this, even in the constrained world that ArenaNet live in. And I do want to talk about these, because it baffles me the decisions that the studio made. Now, I want to be clear. I have hindsight here. I'm just a guy that's played it after it's out and it's all manifested. And I can see the gaps. They themselves, today, can probably see the gaps as well. I don't know whether I could have ever predicted that it would go this badly or would have made better decisions myself. But let's go back and see what could have happened. First of all, let's assume we're at the start of the Icebrood Saga. If the big ticket objective of the Icebrood Saga was always to kill Jormag and Primordus in the one season, if that's what they wanted to do, and I do believe that probably is true, that's already so much subject material. You need to calibrate the Icebrood Saga around that subject material. Why is it in the original Icebrood Saga trailer we see like an arc about centaurs whipping humans? Don't do a centaur arc. You've already got a ton of other stuff about the depths of Tyrion, about the Norn, and about the Asura and so on. Why are we seeing stuff about a Char civil war? Even though it's cool, and even though I love the characters, and I've wanted to see the Cogs of War expansion for years, why are you ham-fisting and rushing that in here? It's not appropriate for this story. It doesn't even have to happen right now. Imagine an Icebrood Saga that did away with the Char stuff, and it's after Primordus and Jormag's death that the results of Bangar rallying the Char since Crecia ended and so on begins to manifest, and he starts marching his people around. There was no point in rushing this so quick. This saga should have been focused entirely on the Icebrood, the Norn, the Asura, the Dwarves, and these 2 dragons. That's it. Have Jarvi, Have Zodja as a main character. Have the Arcane Council have a bit more influence. Have the Skrit as characters. Have the Dredge, who kind of have feet in both of these arcs. Don't waste your time. Even stuff like the Coden, as interestingly as the devs did it early in the Icebrood Saga, you are trying to do something massive and significant. Every moment of story gameplay you produce should be around paying off on the big ticket objectives. Second, and this is easy to say, if it was possible, they probably would have done it, but if we're back at the start of the Icebrood Saga, I have to point out, give the Saga the resources it needs to actually be expansion worthy. People might have bought this. You might not have had to cut and swap and course correct if you actually put legendary weapons in this saga, if you actually put elite specs into this saga, if you actually did bigger things with the mastery system. This stuff had to be there. You didn't do it, and kind of created this massive problem for yourself later down the line. Moving on. Let's assume everything happened as it did, and we're now in the room, right at the moment the expansion's been decided on, and the Icebrood Saga is being slashed. You know you're going to get all the way up to the story with Ryland being chosen as a champion, but after that, it's one release, and you got to figure out the best way that you can deal it. You know that you've got basically a year and a half of content to fill in this gap, and you've got to conclude the story. What the hell are you going to do? First and most obvious option here is to course correct the story as well. You cannot do this. You cannot introduce... Remember, Primordus was not really active in the story before the Bangar conversations, right when it all went to pot. You cannot introduce and slay an entire Elder Dragon, Primordus, and another one, Jormag, in what is essentially one Living World patch split up and spread out a bit. Do not kill them both. Save one of them, or even both of them, for later. What I'm suggesting is you could have done a complete story suspension for this year and a half. Freeze those big plots that you know you can no longer deliver any kind of decent bar of quality on. Freeze them. Jormag appears, chooses Ryland as its champion. You get that nice big cinematic. This is basically the end of the Icebrood Saga now. You can tell your community about it right now, what's happened, so that they're in the know. Don't wait 9 months and then offhandedly in a live stream make one of your writers deliver a vague apology about it. Tell people the score straight away. Have a mini patch that ends the Icebrood Saga. Now, at this point in the story, Primordus is asleep, so you don't have to explain anything there. You do have to find a way to hand-wave Jormag for a year and a half. And this isn't ideal, I'll give you that. You already hand-waved Jormag's activities during Path of Fire by having Timey put it to sleep, and now it's woken up, and now you're going to hand-wave it again. The easiest way, I believe, is you could have had a mini patch in which Jormag, now galvanized by having this new champion, Ryland, is rampaging and taking a bunch of territory. But it's mysteriously not territory here at Tyria. It's out off towards the supercontinent and further up north and doing more damage to the Coden. You give the players the sense this dragon is doing something and you're on borrowed time, but you can stall it for a bit. And one way to really make it sink in, and I do think you could have sold this to the player base, is to have affected the world map art. Remember how after Path of Fire came out, or just before, they moved the brand and it had suddenly extended a lot further? Well, maybe after this mini release that ends the Icebrood Saga, suddenly everywhere up north is completely frozen in. The Isles of Janthir on the art no longer look black and, molten. Instead, it's just like frozen peaks. All the waters around there are frosted and iced over. Everywhere in the Verdant Cascades or around near where we've been playing in the Verdant Cascades, it's all icy and the whole thing looks different to open the map. You know Jormag is doing stuff. It's dangerous, it's an Elder Dragon, but it is also a little off-screen. And at that point, you can leave the story. You've told the player base that the expansion is what you're working on, and you can focus this year and a half on other stuff. Jormag and Primordus can be dealt with after End of Dragons. Give them the breathing room that they need. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that that can't have happened. The devs know that they had the course correct story option. They chose not to go with it. They decided that no, absolutely, both these dragons need to be dead for the Canther expansion. The Canther expansion has to be End of Dragons. No questions asked. It was non-negotiable. And I think if you ask the question of why is that non-negotiable, it can lead us into a fairly depressing area. I honestly don't think that ArenaNet believes in Guild Wars 2 anymore. I think it was non-negotiable because they want to put out a new game. I think they wanted to put out that new game after Living World Season 4, didn't manage to, and instead they're going to be doing it after End of Dragons. The problem is, there's still a ton of Guild Wars 2 story left to do with dragons, and they're not interested in dragons anymore. They know that a lot of the player base isn't interested in dragons anymore, and the idea of the Elder Dragon threat is really the Guild Wars 2 story. It wouldn't be a story for a Guild Wars 3 or a Project Tyria or whatever else that they've got their eyes on, so they need to get through them. And so they said, fuck it, we'll rush it, we have to kill them anyway. And for what it's worth, this maybe doesn't mean ArenaNet doesn't care about Guild Wars 2, but it definitely means they don't care about the Elder Dragon story anymore. They might be more bored of it than even you are. And some of you guys watching this video might think, well, that's fine, I am bored of the Elder Dragon story. But let me stop you there. The only reason you're bored by the Elder Dragon story is because of the way that they have written and delivered the Elder Dragon story. There's nothing fundamentally bad about it. You've just been given stuff that hasn't captivated your imagination, and now that they're turning their backs on it too, you're not fighting back against it. But for me, as a player who actually wanted to see this story done properly and not completely fall apart at the end, I think this is devastating. And just that signal of what this release is, that the devs would rather rush through at all costs to reveal whatever it is after End of Dragons, whether that's some new exciting development for Guild Wars 2 itself or a new game, I think it's pretty sickening, and a betrayal of everything that they've been building up. Let me ask you, ArenaNet, when I'm playing the End of Dragons and I see your teaser for the next game or the next big storyline, like how at the end of Eye of the North I saw Primordus opening his eye, why should I care this time? How do I know you're not going to get bored again and rush it out in a non-meaningful way? So that's bad enough. But here's the other thing. Even in this world, where course correcting is non-negotiable, where these dragons have to be dead so that Cantha can be the End of Dragons, even in this world, it was workable. And they could have done these story beats in a quality way by building them into End of Dragons itself. My suggestion here is that you have Jormag rampaging around, doing whatever. At the beginning of End of Dragons, you budget into End of Dragons an epic opening cutscene that players have no idea about, where the opening gambit, the beginning thing of the X-Back, is Jormag comes to attack and is immediately eaten or something by the deep sea dragon. And you're like, whoa, what the hell happened there? And yes, players have been cheated out of an Elder Dragon fight there in one cutscene, that's true, but it's also occurred at the very beginning of an X-Back that has very suddenly changed the status of the world, and you have a whole playground and expansion to experience that in right here, right now. And I think people would buy that as a very climactic, interesting opening act. We're so used to going into an expansion and an Elder Dragon will be dead at the end of it. Well, this one, we started an expansion and suddenly one was dead and we never expected that. That would have worked. And what would it have cost you? One cutscene. You can still have End of Dragons in a state where these Elder Dragons are out of play, but you budget that actual moment into End of Dragons itself, and you start the story of End of Dragons with the destruction of them so that you can do it properly. The entire franchise is about these moments. You need to pay for the development of them. Now, let's assume that this had happened. They had stopped the Icebrood saga. They'd saved the major story beats for later or at the start of End of Dragons or whatever. They still have 1.5 to 2 years to actually fill with content because they don't have Champions content coming out now. So what do? Well, actually, I would argue they could do much more beneficial stuff than these random DRM releases. Option 1, they could essentially keep going with the story, but now they do a side arc. They don't have much budget. They have a skeleton crew, so tell a story that is worthy of that. Now is the time to do something smaller scale, but that people still want to see. Now is the time for something like a Wizard's Tower arc, or stories based in the home race areas, which they've never got around to doing. This is a point where maybe we can revisit the Desolation and do stuff that Path of Fire itself was weak on. You can botch the endings on these story beats because they're smaller stories anyway, and you're not betraying the biggest part of the game. And the community knows that they're going to be a bit small and a bit rubbish because you told them. That's option 1. Option 2 is to go full gung-ho on actually implementing Living World Season 1 so that it's ready for End of Dragons release and so that it's ready for the Steam launch and so that the game can actually be played as a full story and will stop leaking players because you're making an MMO that's all about the plot and new people can't even get into it. Or option 3, and this one's actually my favorite, You completely stopped story content. I'm serious. No story whatsoever for a year and a half. The great dichotomy at the heart of this game is the casual story players versus the serious long-term players that like stuff like fractals and raids and, you know, the real content, so to speak. So why not actually, because you haven't done this for years, focus purely on that other set of players. No story patches that don't provide meaningful gameplay. How about for this year and a half, you don't invent dragon response missions, invent a new format of like mini fractals. How about you don't abandon strike missions, but you go crazy with strike missions? You know, mini single encounter raids, essentially, a well-balanced strike mission could be. How about you keep going with that? You don't damage your reputation even more for completely U-turning and all the stuff you implement. Just add loads of those throughout the whole year and a half, something that people can consistently log in on and be excited about, because the only way to retain players is not to keep diving forwards with single-player story instances. It's the actual meaningful gameplay instances that many of your vets are asking for. Maybe you can't release a whole raid during this year and a half. Maybe that's too hard for you, but you can at least provide quality of life to raids, slight tweaks and improvements. You can provide quality of life to world versus world and to PvP. A year filled with these kinds of patches. A year filled that does actually do significant PvE skill balance that people can apply in new stuff. And rewards. You don't have to spam out tons of new weapon sets. You could have gone with just like one legend. You've finally done it and gone with a legendary amulet. What if that had happened a year and a half ago, but it was a new incentive for people to get back into like the earlier raid wings that maybe they're not doing too much, or the fractals that they've not been doing too much, or any of these other really powerful, potent, verdant areas of the game that have been neglected in favor of DRMs. The bridge between expansions does not have to look like living world that is nothing but single-player story instances. The bridge between expansions, as many other MMOs have proved, can be focusing on the other half of the game. The bit where people are playing in and getting invested in their progression and their skills and so on. Really. Okay, WP, you're talking nonsense. They couldn't course correct on the story. They couldn't course correct on the format. It has to be one more Living World release that continues this story, introduces, and is going to kill both of these dragons. It has to be that way. It is what it is. Well, let me stop you there. There are still so many basic decisions they could have made that would have paved this over better. Let's run through them. First, give Primordus a victory somewhere in these DRMs. At some point with him waking up, let Primordus do something. Anything. You're about to kill him off. Be bold for a second. Remember what I described about the world map art and freezing a ton of stuff with Jormag a second ago? Do this, but if you have to go into this world, do it but for Primordus instead. As great as it probably and deserved would have been in the story for him to attack the Asura and blow up Ratasum or something as a big opening act, if you can't do that because it's too much, have him dominate some off-screen place, like, oh, I don't know, the Dominion of Winds? Obviously, you decided you want a little bit of a tie to the Tengu to lead into whatever this Canthan stuff is later. They could have been bold and have Primordus ruin that place. A real tragedy that properly stings people because you'll never properly get to walk inside there and explore it because Primordus destroyed the place. And maybe when that actually happens in End of Dragons, it's a smoldering crater. And now these great defensive walls that we've been marveling at for all these years are lopped to the side and broken and destroyed because Primordus messed up those Tengu. And look, we even have precedent for that in the core story where the destroyers had been attacking the gates anyway. Have him win something so that he doesn't look completely impotent, and preferably tie it to the Asura or something. Give Aurene something meaningful to do. Through all these DRMs, she was just standing there on the vague idea that, oh, I shouldn't get involved. And then finally in this release, she decides she does get involved in kind of a weird, tangible way, and it all fell apart. Look, you already had storylines and plots from Season 4 about how she's kind of an independent character that likes to fly off and do her own thing sometimes. At the start of the DRMs, have her look in the scrying pool, see something weird, and then she's off. And maybe she still communicates to us a little bit through Kaith, but in general, that big raging question of why do I have an Elder Dragon just standing there doing nothing the entire time isn't on our minds. Balance the characters better. Why are we dealing with Marjorie and Canuck and Casimir and all these characters that don't have a big stake in this particular story? Present Jarvie more. Put Timey in there. Zodja may be a no-go for whatever off-screen reason. Have Ogden have a little bit more dialogue once the dwarves are introduced. Keep the Ritlock, Crecia and Bangar stuff for consistency with Drizzlewood. But they wasted so much time. Even the instance where we get to interact with the Tengu a bit at the Dominion of Winds feels completely inefficient and amateurish when you have such precious little time to do this big stuff and you're squandering it on talking to rocks in Bloodtide Coast. Cut the Bram controlling Primordus thing. It's too big for one patch, plus all this other stuff. Yeah, you had a little bit with the Spirits of the Wild before. Yeah, you've already set up the Prophecy. Those two elements probably do need to factor into Champions somehow. But the whole thing of him going into Primordus' mind and controlling the uncontrollable hurricane of force not only betrays what's kind of cool about Primordus, but ultimately, since you didn't have the balls to have a big ending to it, was a waste of time. I like the idea of spending some time with Draconis Mons. That probably should have been right there at the start. Champions 1 power to get Primordus into play instantly so he can have a little bit of screen time. There's another concept that they could have done with Primordus, for what it's worth, that I would have adored and I think would have really worked for the Icebrood saga. And it's this. Since you can't give Primordus any real screen time anyway, and you're killing him, lean into it. All of Champions could have been about Jormag. All about sneakiness and manipulation and persuasion and vague suggestions about threats on the horizon and an enemy. Maybe even lead people to think that she's talking about the deep sea dragon more than anything else. Don't waste time with all this dragon twinning stuff, which basically is so insubstantially defined that it may as well not be there. Set the whole thing up about Jormag. The Icebrood saga, it's all of Champions is her, and it's all about setting up a big battle against Jormag. Then, at this patch, this half an hour release, we move in, we're feeling tense, we know that we're about to fight this Elder Dragon, and boom, she is devoured by the maw of an even greater being bursting up from below. It's Primordus. He's here, and he's just eating his fill. Turns out this was never going to be a Jormag boss battle. It's a Primordus boss battle. You still get Dragon v Dragon, you still kill both of them, and yeah, Primordus still would have lost a lot of meaningful screen time, but at least you got something of an exciting and unexpected real moment out of it. I'm not saying stories have to have big twists to be interesting. I really don't believe that. But what they did by comparison was banal. It was paint by numbers. I think we could have got something better. And let's talk about DRMs for what it's worth. They were essentially a world tour in which random mini filler arcs popped up with dragon minions sieging certain areas of the world. In all of them, we're basically just dicking around. What happens in this final patch where Aurene realizes that she can be drawn to the ley lines and so on has nothing to do with any of the victories or events that took place in any of those previous DRMs. Champions 1 could have remained as some general world Tory attacks, and the idea of the truce with Jormag I think is a good beat that they could have left. But by the end of Champions 1, immediately we should be working out an actual way to bring these dragons together and how we're going to fight them. Maybe that explicit conversation we start having with Aurene about that, setting up the battle from an earlier point, would have made Jormag feel completely betrayed, and then that's why Jormag decides to attack and the truce is broken in part 2. It all should have been about recruiting allies specifically to help us in specific ways in the battle. The battlefield itself shouldn't have been flung to us. I believe it's around Anvil Rock here in this release that we just kind of teleport to. We should have been seeing and scouting and investigating that battlefield and plotting it out all these patches ago. All of these DRM releases should have been revolving around that final confrontation, not wasting our time with irrelevance, essentially. I mean, yeah, it's nice to be in Fireheart Rise, and this time we're setting up the Flame Legion standards. It's nice to go to Ebonhawk and hear a little bit more about them 10 years ago. You don't have the time for that now, though. It's not a worthy trade. I question even the release schedule for the DRMs. Remember around the first patch where we were kind of unclear as to whether the dragon response missions would all come in at once or they'd slowly filter in with new allies? I genuinely think that would have been a better idea because it would have deconstructed in the minds of the audience what this release was. Many of us are still in this mindset where we're thinking, oh, it's patch day, this is a big patch for us to play, and then being underwhelmed by it not being many missions or even just half an hour here. But if over the past Champions months, the new instances had been gradually trickling in on more regular but much smaller, more bite-sized releases, I think it would have alleviated some of the pains here. And finally, speaking about releases, why was this release, this shoddy, half-baked thing, pushed 2 weeks earlier? Remember, the original schedule had this for the end of May. This thing should have been pushed 2 weeks later or more so that they can actually get time to do stuff like, I don't know, model the whole damn dragon. You know, one of the concept artists tweeted concepts that they'd made for a full-size Primordus and for a full-size Jormag doesn't appear in game. Why are you rushing this release out? It's not like End of Dragons is next week. We're still waiting 3 months before you even give us more information about it. I can't understand why they would think saving these 2 to 4 weeks or so is that important. I mean, is the bottom line and the profits of getting people in for the gem store just that close to the wire right now? I mean, I know the answer, and so should you. I said it earlier. It's because, guys, they don't care about the Elder Dragon plot anymore. So what does it matter if it comes out half-baked? That's what they're signaling to me. So there you have it. That's the current state of things with the story. I'm really disappointed. I do think that End of Dragons itself will probably be of a high bar and will be exciting, but it's come at a hell of a cost, and I genuinely do believe that even really mediocre like filler patches that you'll easily forget, like somewhere in the middle of Season 1 or somewhere in the middle of Season 2, or even like extra and very weird patches like we had Siren's Landing at the end of Season 3, and, you know, that even did some damage to the Lazarus story. All of those were a million times better than what we just experienced. I think that they've drawn a line now that they can't go back on. This is the main subject material they have to be so delicate and careful about, and they weren't. I do want to reiterate, I have the benefit of hindsight here, and I do feel a lot of sympathy for the devs. I'm sure there are people at the studio that do still care about the Elder Dragon plot. I've sort of thrown an avalanche of shit at the studio here, but these decisions overall, they're sort of crushing, really. I'll give it a few more playthroughs. You'll probably be able to hear more of my thoughts and feelings on this in subsequent videos, particularly my daily podcast about the expansion. Thanks for watching, guys. Let me know what you think. I'll see you next time.
He was right. With the death of their master, destroyers lost their motivation. Chalice and his dwarves pursued them into the depths of the earth. Legends were born that day. And while this threat was ended, the legends would continue. In the years to come, new threats would arise in Tyria. New creatures would stir. New sacrifices would be made. And the greatest threat of all was yet to come. A threat that would consume the entire world and call upon the greatest of heroes, the children of the legends.